What if the most advanced weapons of World War II were not forged from steel or dropped from the sky, but refined, molecule by molecule, in a laboratory? Imagine the icy skies of early 1944. Germany burned under the weight of Allied bombers, and yet, above the clouds, something new began to roar. It wasn't a new plane. It wasn't a new gun. It was fuel. A strange purple gasoline that lit the heart of a P-51 Mustang. On a quiet runway in Dayton, Ohio, a test pilot clutched the throttle, the engine roaring beyond its limits. The tachometer readout: 400, 40, 40. And then, the impossible: 448 miles an hour. The balance of war was about to change, not just because of courage, but because of chemistry. Because sometimes, the tiniest molecules can decide the fate of an empire. By early 1944, the war in Europe had entered a new, exhausting phase. The Allied bombing campaign was fierce but costly. Hundreds of American bombers were falling on German defenses. Pilots prayed that their escorting fighters could fly farther, faster, higher, and survive to return home. The P-51 Mustang had become a symbol of Allied air power, sleek and deadly, but even its legendary range and agility were limited by one thing: fuel. What the world didn't know was that behind the hangars and newspaper headlines, a quiet revolution was underway. In laboratories across America and Britain, chemists, engineers, and petroleum scientists were fighting their own invisible war. Their weapon was not gunpowder or armor. It was octane. Through years of experimentation, they created a new aviation fuel, so powerful it could make conventional engines perform like supercharged miracles. They called it Grade 150. It glowed purple, smelled faintly metallic and dangerous, and carried with it the promise of victory. This is the story of how that fuel, not planes, not pilots, but chemistry, turned the tide of World War II. Before the roar of the engines and the fury of the skies, the war for air supremacy began somewhere far quieter, in laboratories, classrooms, and refineries. It was not a battle of bullets. It was a battle of molecules. In the late 1930s, aviation was still a young science. Most aircraft engines depended on gasoline that would detonate far too soon under pressure. Engineers called it knock, a violent premature explosion inside the cylinder that robbed engines of power and tore them apart from within. To fight knock, chemists needed to raise the octane rating, a measure of how much a fuel could be compressed before it ignited on its own. Higher octane meant more compression meant more power, and more power meant a faster climb, a sharper turn, a greater chance to live. But there was a problem. In 1940, America's aviation gasoline averaged just 87 octane, fine for trainers, useless for warplanes. Across the Atlantic, the British were desperate. Their Royal Air Force had fought the Luftwaffe to a standstill during the Battle of Britain, but every pilot knew the truth. Their Spitfires were running at the edge of their limits. Then came a miracle: the development of 100-octane fuel. It arrived just in time. With the help of American oil companies, British engineers introduced the higher-grade gasoline in 1940, and suddenly the Spitfires and Hurricanes gained a second wind. Speeds jumped by 30 to 40 miles per hour, climb rates by nearly 1,000 feet per minute. The Germans noticed. They couldn't understand why their once superior fighters were being outpaced in the very skies they had once dominated. The answer wasn't in the wings. It was in the fuel lines. By 1941, a new figure emerged: General James Doolittle, an aviator, engineer, and visionary. Before he became famous for his daring raid over Tokyo, Doolittle had already fought another kind of war, a war of persuasion. He traveled from refinery to refinery, meeting with oil executives, scientists, and military planners, urging them to invest in the future of aviation fuel. He told them bluntly, "Whoever controls the air will control the war, and whoever controls the fuel will control the air." Doolittle understood what few did at the time. Airplanes could only evolve as far as their fuel allowed them. You could design the most advanced engine in the world, but if your gasoline couldn't withstand pressure, your wings were useless. In Louisiana, Texas, and New Jersey, American chemists took his warning to heart. One of them was Eugène Houdry, a French immigrant who had fled war-torn Europe and brought with him a revolutionary process: catalytic cracking. It allowed refineries to break crude oil into smaller, more efficient molecules, boosting both octane and energy output. Houdry's process turned ordinary petroleum into high-performance aviation fuel. It was chemistry turned into strategy, science turned into survival. By 1943, 17 refineries across the United States were producing millions of gallons of 130-grade gasoline every month. It flowed through pipelines, across the ocean, and into the tanks of P-38 Lightnings, P-47 Thunderbolts, and the early models of the P-51 Mustang. At first, the Allies believed they had reached the limit of what gasoline could do. Engines like the Rolls-Royce Merlin were already straining against their mechanical thresholds. But science had one more surprise. Deep inside a laboratory at Wright Field, Ohio, American chemists were experimenting with something radical: a new formula that used exotic hydrocarbons like toluene and xylene, stabilized by tetraethyl lead, a toxic but powerful additive that prevented detonation under extreme pressure. What they created was unlike anything the world had ever seen: a fuel that did not break under stress, a fuel that laughed in the face of heat and compression, a fuel that would one day glow purple and bear a number that sounded almost mythical: grade 150. At that time, even the best German fuel, the so-called C3 synthetic gasoline, barely reached the equivalent of Allied 130-grade fuel. It was good, but not great. Worse, the German system was fragile. Their entire fuel industry depended on the Fischer-Tropsch process, turning coal into liquid fuel. It was ingenious but slow, expensive, and vulnerable to bombing. While the Americans built massive refineries along their protected coastline, Germany was burying factories underground, hiding from Allied bombers. Each raid crippled production. Each day, their tanks, trucks, and aircraft were forced to ration fuel more tightly. The difference grew with every month. For every gallon of aviation gasoline Germany produced, America produced 10. That imbalance was not just logistical, it was existential. You could not win the skies if you could not fuel them. As 1943 gave way to 1944, the chemists' war, the quiet, invisible war of chemistry and industry, began to reveal its power. The laboratories of Wright Field and the Royal Aircraft Establishment were on the verge of rewriting the laws of aerial combat. The first batches of grade 150 fuel gleamed in the light, tinted purple for identification. The test notes were astonishing. Engines that had once detonated under stress now ran smooth. Manifold pressures that would once destroy pistons now delivered raw power. It was a small miracle born from mathematics and molecules, a fuel that made the impossible possible. And soon, it would leave the laboratory behind and take to the skies, where the outcome of World War II itself would be measured not only in courage and firepower, but in chemistry. The test field at Wright-Patterson, Dayton, Ohio, shimmered under the pale winter sun. On that morning in early 1944, the air smelled of cold metal and burnt oil. A lone P-51B Mustang stood at the end of the runway, its polished skin gleaming like a blade. Inside the cockpit, the pilot steadied his breathing. This was not just another test flight, it was a step into the unknown. He pushed the throttle forward. The Merlin engine roared, its exhaust flames streaking blue against the snow. The manifold pressure needle climbed beyond 60, then 70, and still higher. 75 inches of mercury. Unthinkable. Every mechanic on the ground froze. No piston engine had ever survived that kind of stress. Yet the Mustang didn't falter. It screamed forward, accelerating past 400, 420, 440, until the airspeed indicator edged past 448 miles per hour. The pilot's voice crackled over the radio. "It's smooth," he said, disbelief cutting through the static. "Running clean and steady." The engineers looked at each other in silence. They understood what they were witnessing. Not an improvement, but a revolution. The purple-tinted gasoline inside that engine, grade 150, had rewritten the laws of physics. Before this moment, Allied pilots could only push their engines so far before the fuel rebelled, detonating violently in the cylinders. Now, the new mixture allowed them to squeeze out unimaginable power without tearing the machinery apart. It was as if the P-51 had grown new lungs. Within weeks, the results spread across the Atlantic. Crates of purple fuel drums began arriving at Royal Air Force depots in England. The labels were clear and ominous. 150 grade, handle with care. Ground crews wore masks and gloves. The lead content was toxic, but nobody cared. They knew what it meant. In May 1944, selected squadrons of the 8th Air Force received their first shipment. It was a secret, quietly distributed among the most experienced groups. Pilots were briefed behind closed doors. The message was simple. You are about to fly faster than any enemy alive. The difference was immediate. At 25,000 feet, a Mustang fueled with standard 130 grade gasoline could reach about 437 miles per hour. With the purple fuel, the same aircraft under the same pilot broke 448 with ease. The increase might seem small on paper, barely 10 miles per hour. But in combat, 10 miles per hour was life or death. German pilots flying Bf-109s and FW-190s soon felt the change. For months, they had studied the Mustang's habits, its climb rate, its turning radius, its weaknesses. Now, those rules no longer applied. The Americans had changed the equation overnight. Across the Channel, the Royal Air Force was preparing for another crisis: the arrival of the V-1 flying bombs. These pilotless weapons hurtled toward London at nearly 400 miles per hour, too fast for most fighters to intercept. But Mustangs running on 150 grade fuel could catch them. One British pilot described the pursuit as chasing death with fire. On June 18, 1944, Major R.E. Turner of the 356th Fighter Squadron intercepted a V-1. He couldn't risk shooting. The explosion might kill him. Instead, he edged his Mustang's wingtip to within inches of the bomb's wing and tipped it, using airflow to send the V-1 tumbling into the fields below. It exploded harmlessly. Turner survived, and the legend of the purple fuel grew. By the time the Normandy invasion began, American and British fighter groups were drinking the purple fire by the gallon. Every mission report told the same story: faster climbs, tighter turns, longer pursuits. German intelligence officers were baffled. Their pilots insisted the new American planes could accelerate endlessly, breaking every known limit. The reports were dismissed as exaggeration until captured samples of Allied fuel confirmed the truth. In Berlin, Luftwaffe analysts stared at laboratory results that seemed impossible. How had the Allies achieved a performance number of 150 when pure iso-octane defined the ceiling at 100? The answer was buried in chemistry: aromatic hydrocarbons like toluene and xylene blended with lead additives to stabilize combustion at extreme compression. It was alchemy turned to science, industry transformed into a weapon. For the pilots, the new fuel was both a blessing and a burden. The increased boost came at a price. Faster wear, fouled spark plugs, burned valves. Maintenance crews worked double shifts replacing parts, scraping off lead deposits, and recalibrating engines after every sortie. But nobody complained. Every time a Mustang roared past a fleeing German fighter, the effort felt worth it. One American pilot later said, "It was like flying with thunder in your hands. The plane didn't just move, it lunged." By late summer of 1944, the skies over France were filled with the sound of those lungs of thunder. The Allies had found a way to turn chemistry into dominance. The Luftwaffe, once proud and unchallenged, now faced an enemy whose very fuel seemed alive. And while generals debated strategies and governments planned invasions, in the refineries of Louisiana and the laboratories of Ohio, thousands of anonymous men and women continued to refine the formula, drum by drum, gallon by gallon, building the silent weapon that would win the air war. The purple fuel had taken flight, and with it, the promise that the industrial heart of democracy could overcome even the most fearsome machine of tyranny. By autumn, the balance of the skies had shifted irreversibly. Every flight of P-51 Mustangs blazing across Europe carried within them the quiet hum of innovation, the heartbeat of freedom itself. In the Grand Chronicle of World War II, historians often speak of tanks, generals, and battles. But here, high above the clouds, victory came from a different kind of courage. The courage to believe that science could outthink brutality, and that knowledge could outfly fear. By the autumn of 1944, the skies over Europe had changed forever. What began as a desperate race for survival had become a demonstration of industrial and scientific supremacy. The Luftwaffe, once the terror of Europe, was now a shadow, starved of fuel, pilots, and hope. Everywhere, signs of collapse showed. German factories still rolled out new aircraft, Messerschmitts, Focke-Wulfs, even the futuristic Me-262 jet. But there was no fuel to fly them. Planes sat silent on runways, their tanks dry, their engines empty. Training flights were cancelled. Young recruits were sent into combat after barely 30 hours of flight time. Meanwhile, across the Channel, American refineries ran day and night. The pipelines throbbed with life, carrying the purple gasoline that fed 1,000 engines every sunrise. Between May 1944 and April 1945, the 8th Air Force alone consumed over 53 million gallons of grade 150 fuel. Each drop represented not just chemistry, but coordination. Miners, engineers, dock workers, truck drivers, and chemists, all united in a single, relentless rhythm. This was more than production. It was purpose turned into power. When Allied bombers targeted Germany's synthetic fuel plants at Leuna and Pölitz, the effect was devastating. Without fuel, German tanks couldn't move, bombers couldn't fly, and the once proud Luftwaffe turned from predator to prey. By late 1944, pilots like Lieutenant Hollis Bud Nahlen of the 357th Fighter Group were flying missions deep into enemy territory, confident in both their planes and the invisible force pulsing through their engines. One day over Eastern Europe, Nahlen engaged a Messerschmitt Bf 109. He dove, accelerated, and in seconds closed the distance. His guns barked a short burst, one hit, one kill. Later, his German counterpart, Gerhard Gerd Schack, would recall the encounter with disbelief. "The American plane came upon me like lightning. I thought my instruments were broken. I could not escape." That was the power of grade 150. It turned equations into instincts, calculations into muscle memory. The pilots didn't have to think about chemistry. They simply felt its strength in the way their planes surged forward. For every pilot who climbed into a Mustang, there were hundreds who never flew. The refinery chemists, the mechanics, the men and women who cleaned the lead deposits from spark plugs, who labeled each barrel with care, who ensured that every aircraft left the ground with perfection in its veins. They never saw combat, but they fought their war in white coats and work gloves. Back in Berlin, as the war collapsed around him, Hermann Göring looked to the skies and saw the silver wings of P-51s cutting through the clouds. He turned to his staff and muttered, "When I saw Mustangs over Berlin, I knew the war was lost." It was not an admission of fear. It was a confession of reality. The Luftwaffe had been defeated not by numbers alone, but by something it could neither see nor stop, the combined intellect and industry of free nations. In the last months of the war, Allied air power became absolute. Missions that once required careful planning became routine. The German skies, once filled with danger, were now highways of Allied control. For every German aircraft that took off, 10 were destroyed on the ground. April 1945, the airfields of the Reich lay in ruins. Fuel drums burned like funeral pyres. In hangars filled with silence, half-finished planes waited for pilots who would never return. And above it all, the Mustangs flew. Same planes, same engines, but a new kind of lifeblood running through them. The purple fire of innovation, the invisible edge of democracy, had conquered the air. Historians often mark wars by battles and dates: Normandy, the Ardennes, Berlin. But the real turning point of World War II was far more subtle. It happened in the laboratories of Wright Field and the Royal Aircraft Establishment, in the refineries of Louisiana, in the chemical plants of New Jersey, and in the minds of scientists who believed that reason could overcome ruin. Every nation built planes. Only a few built the future. The victory of 1945 was not just a triumph of courage or weaponry. It was the triumph of curiosity, cooperation, and creativity. The men and women who refined grade 150 gasoline never fired a shot, but every drop they produced was a bullet in the fight for freedom. Their work gave wings to faith, faith that innovation mattered, that intellect could defend liberty, and that progress, even in its quietest form, could shape destiny. When peace finally came in May 1945, the world celebrated its heroes, the soldiers, the generals, the flags. But somewhere in the background, the laboratories went silent. The machines stopped, the drums emptied, and for the first time in years, the smell of leaded gasoline faded from the air. The scientists went home, carrying with them the quiet satisfaction that their war had been fought and won, not in blood, but in brilliance. That was the legacy of the purple fuel. It burned hot, but what it left behind was light, and in that light, the free world would rise again. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, the world exhaled, not in triumph, but in exhaustion. Cities lay in ruins. Millions were gone. Yet, in the ashes of destruction, there was also the quiet hum of something greater: understanding. Humanity had witnessed not just the cost of war, but the power of what free minds could create when driven by purpose, not fear. The victory of World War II was not won by might alone. It was forged in the hearts of people who refused to surrender their belief in progress. In the foundries and refineries, in laboratories and factories, ordinary men and women built an invisible bridge between science and survival. They did not fight on the front lines, but every gallon of fuel they refined, every engine they tuned, every spark they protected, became a heartbeat in the great body of freedom. Grade 150 gasoline was more than a chemical achievement. It was a symbol, a purple flame that burned for liberty. It told the world that democracy could outthink dictatorship, that reason could outperform rage. The engineers who measured molecules were fighting for more than numbers. They were fighting for a world where truth mattered, where knowledge was the weapon that no tyrant could command. Above the clouds, the P-51 Mustang became their messenger. Each flight over Berlin carried more than bullets. It carried proof that ingenuity, when paired with courage, could overcome cruelty. And below, the chemists who had crafted the miracle fuel stood in silence, watching victory unfold in contrails and sunlight. In the decades since World War II, the world has built faster planes, stronger engines, and cleaner fuels. But the lesson remains timeless. Real power is not destruction. It is understanding. Every generation inherits the same question. What will we do with our knowledge? Build walls or bridges, weapons or wonders? So tonight, if you hear the distant hum of an aircraft crossing the sky, remember what that sound once meant. It was not just the echo of war. It was the voice of humanity rising from the darkness, powered by chemistry, courage, and hope. The story of Grade 150 fuel reminds us that victory is never only about domination. It is about the triumph of spirit, of minds that refuse to yield, and of nations that chose collaboration over chaos. World War II ended long ago, but the fight for peace never truly ends. Each of us still holds a spark to eliminate fascism, to fight for peace, to fight for national independence, to fight for justice, to fight for freedom. If this story moved you, share it. Keep the memory alive. Because history does not only belong to the past, it lives in every choice we make, every truth we defend, every voice that dares to speak for peace.